Hi, everybody. This is David Nevins, and welcome to Citybiz List. And today we continue with another of our discussions in partnership with an organization called the Bridge Alliance. And these discussions we're calling Repairing America's Broken Democracy. So most of us think it needs a little bit of work. Our guest today is Heather Balas. Heather, welcome to our program.
Thanks, David.
And Heather, you are the Vice President of Programs for Election Reformers Network, correct?
Right. Yep.
So let's begin, Heather. Tell us a little bit about what Election Reformers Network is.
Sure.
And then tell us a little bit about yourself. And I understand you have a fascinating background, which we're interested in hearing about.
Well, I don't know about fascinating, but I will tell you that the Election Reformers Network is a cross-partisan public policy organization. We're committed to advancing a fair and trusted election process in the United States. And there's a number of organizations in our country that are trying to strengthen and reform American democracy right now. And we're thrilled by that. One of the things that sets Election Reformers Network apart from some of the others that are in this space is our roots in international work. So our foundation's, our organization's founder and executive director, Kevin Johnson, is a leading expert on the democratic challenges that are facing countries around the world. And he and our founding board members bring decades of experience in international efforts to this space. And so when we think about Election Reformers Network, we think of the global perspective that experience brings to looking at the problems that we're facing here at home.
So, it sounds like a laudable goal for sure. Heather, do tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to the position you're in. I understand you're, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a fifth generation New Mexican. I wasn't sure New Mexico had been a state for that many generations, but I guess I'm wrong.
We absolutely have. And so, yes, I am. I'm a longtime New Mexican. My family farms and ranches in eastern New Mexico. And I grew up in a family, as one might expect, with mixed political views. And so professionally, I've always been drawn to policy solutions that bring us together as Americans rather than pulling us apart. It's one of the things that's so important and a key element of Election Reformers Network work is that we pull people together across party lines in a cross-partisan fashion, because that's the only way that we will have democracy reforms that will sustain changes in administration, changes in election practice. And prior to joining Election Reformers Network, I had the privilege for 12 years of running an organization that had a really similar objective. Here in our state, New Mexico First is a cross-partisan public policy organization that brings people together across party lines to develop recommendations for our legislature. And so having led that work in our state, which is very politically diverse, very racially and ethnically diverse, very economically diverse, we saw that people came together and there was more that united them on a whole host of policy areas, from water and healthcare to governance and economy. If we can do that here, then our attitude is that Americans can do that in other places as well. And so it's really exciting to get to bring some of that state level experience to the team at ERN that has historically focused more, as I mentioned, on that global frame.
So Heather, in a few moments ago, you mentioned that one of the goals of the organization was to promote fair and trusted elections. And without getting into the politics of it, it seems that an election can be fair, but not necessarily trusted. And potentially, I guess, vice versa as well. So we live in unique times. Quite obviously. So how does ERN deal with that? And is promoting fair elections a larger goal than promoting trusted elections? It seems to me it's not necessarily the same.
I'm going to say that when we have elections that are fair, and that people have good understanding of how that fairness was achieved, then trust goes with that. One of the reasons that we, I believe, have a bit of a disconnect in our country right now between what is fair and what is trusted is the degree of either misinformation or simply a lack of a lack of education in terms of how our election process works. And, as Americans, we know that our country is home to the oldest modern democracy. We invented it. And so you would think that we've got it all right. But when you go first, it sometimes makes it harder for you to get everything right from the get-go. And so there are some democracies that came behind us that learned a little bit from us and did a few things better. And in the arena of election reform in particular, America is somewhat unique in the degree to which we authorize our election officials to be engaged in partisanship to the degree that they are. And our view at Election Reformers Network is that that's one of the reasons that Americans are less likely to be have confidence in the election outcomes, is because they don't always know that they can trust the officials that are running those elections.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So what at Election Reformers Network, what would some of your policy initiatives be today?
Impartial election administration reform is the thing that we are focused on the most at this point in time. And there's a handful of ways that one could look at that. So in my home state of New Mexico, we're, to my chagrin, in national headlines this week because officials in Otero County decided that they wanted to try to not certify the elections from our recent primary, not because of evidence of problems, but to make a political point. And so our view is that we need an election administration process that is impartial of politics. And to the credit of the folks in Otero County, the county clerk in that area, a Republican, has said that the election was run perfectly and stood by the results. Ultimately, that is what happened, and those results were certified. But that example of the need for ethics by election officials is a piece of is an important potential reform in our space. And this time in America's history, the folks who serve as secretaries of state or county clerks, or in the case of the folks that are like the county commissioners that are certifying elections in our state, they don't have strict requirements in terms of the stepping aside of holding aside their own partisan interests. Secretaries of state in our state, as well as most states around the country, are allowed to fundraise for candidates that they're overseeing the races for. They're allowed to endorse or support candidates that they're overseeing the races for. And they're not always even required to recuse themselves from decisions related to their own races. So if the Secretary of State is running for governor or running for U.S. Senator, and there's a question in terms of how that particular election result, the Secretary of State's not necessarily required to recuse herself or himself from the decision-making associating with those questions. And so when we look at the ethics associated with those people, almost all of them choose to do the right thing. And what we have seen in our country is, even though we didn't have laws that prevented election officials from manipulating a process, we had a culture and a practice that prevented that. And in the era that we're in right now, there's a little bit of a disconnect. Many of those folks continue to behave in that fundamentally ethical way, but their practice, their behavior is distrusted. And then others are running on platforms to say, you know what, I'm running on a platform that I'm going to put my thumb on the scale and try to influence the outcome. And so the notion of statutory ethics codes that prohibit some of the practices I just talked about, fundraising, endorsements, or failure to recuse, are one sort of universe of potential reforms. And I can talk about some more, but let me pause for a second, David, and just say, did that summary make sense? Do you have questions about that?
Yeah, no, it made total sense. And I know, for our viewers' interest, we're conducting this interview in late June, and it won't air for a couple of weeks, but the January 6th hearings are taking place in DC. And yesterday you had, I think, a couple of secretaries of state talking about whether pressure was put on them in their elections. And I'm not sure how many people know that in most states, the Secretary of State oversees the election. And again, in most states, that particular position, for better or for worse, is a partisan one, right? You're in Maryland, where I am speaking to you from. The Secretary of State is appointed by the incumbent governor. And so the governor is either a Democrat or Republican and would therefore naturally appoint someone who was likely to be of the same party. So I know, Heather, you are certainly obvious advocates of the rule of law prevailing in this case. So speak to us a little bit about that, perhaps.
Sure thing. So in our view, there isn't really enough focus on the courts as the proper place for election disputes to be judged. Close elections happen. Candidates have every right, and appropriately so in our country, to ask for recounts if they feel that something's not happened the way that it should have. Then it's really very appropriate for us to be able to have rigorous inspection of what's occurred. And yet, when the courts do rule, then we should be in a place in our country, as we did in 2000 during the Bush-Gore election, to stand by what the courts determine and move forward. The dilemma we face in our country is that it's sometimes not the judicial courts that are guiding our viewpoints about an election, but more the court of public opinion. And when we are governed by something that is as subjective as that, we find ourselves in a pickle in terms of having confidence in the outcomes that we're facing, and in terms of knowing how to move forward. I believe that candidates for public office are almost always guided by a desire to do the right thing. They're in that space because they want to make a difference for their communities or for their state or for our nation. And it is critical, I think, that for the people who are stepping into that leadership function to continue to be the role models that we absolutely need them to be. And that's adhere to rule of law and rely on the courts, not public opinion, as the forum where election questions are resolved.
I think that's very well put. But given the fact that we are sometimes in a pickle, as you put it, a very, very technical term, I know.
Yeah, that's right.
And the fact that you work for and are one of the leaders of the Election Reformers Network, you are at the same time, I believe, someone who is pretty confident or hopeful with regard to the future of our democracy. Am I right about that? And what gives you? Share with us some thoughts on why you are so confident that democracy and election reform will prevail.
Well, first, I'm going to tell you that from my dozen years of running policy deliberations at New Mexico First, I have seen again and again that there is far more that unites us as Americans than divides us. And that reality came through for me in public deliberations on every major public policy issue facing our state. And all of those issues were issues that also were very relevant on the national scene. The other reason that I'm optimistic, in addition to, I think, the reality that there's more that unites us than divides us, is that, in my opinion, those of us that are in the reform space, we're kind of scrappy. We don't give up. We're willing to innovate and try again if one solution doesn't work. And I'll share an anecdote that here in New Mexico, the night that our state passed its redistricting reform, at the time I was part of a coalition that was active in trying to get that bill passed. It cleared our House floor well after midnight on the last night of our legislative session. And so this coalition, we were all up late and we're staring at the screen, hoping that our bill's going to get through. And when it did, a friend and mentor sent around a video of the old Jimmy Cliff song, the one you can get it if you really want, but you must try and try till you succeed at last. And that's what I think is one of the things that gives me hope when I think about the future of democracy, is that as a nation and in the arena of the people that are doing democracy reform, we're just not quitters. We're people who will try and try until we reclaim a governance structure that, regardless of political party or personal background, is one that we can all believe in. And that's what I think we all just have to keep focused on.
Let me that was well put. Let me ask you one last question, Heather. In speaking about election reform, you've been talking about things like integrity and honesty and following the rule of law and the like. Do you all have a position with regard to technology and some of the new technologies out there, and whether we should go to telephone voting and, without getting into great detail, things like that are bound to, over this coming century, change the way we get to vote?
To my knowledge, Election Reformers Network doesn't have a position on that particular topic. What I do know is that a fair number of election administrators over time have pointed to the importance of a paper ballot that can be looked back at afterward, so accountable paper ballot, and one that is the electronic counting of that speeds things along, and yet the paper ballot provides us with a trail so that we can go back and look at it and audit again as needed. So in my view, we're a long way away from having a situation where we would be appropriate with telephone voting, or where we would be comfortable as a nation with telephone voting or internet voting or any of those kinds of reforms. I think
it's interesting to see. Yes.
Yeah. I would back up, though, if we had just a second, David, and just share with you that in addition, when we think about what we can do in the arena of election reform in terms of how we administer our elections, I talked about the code of conduct concept, which is one way that we can do that. But there are a couple of others that are considerations. And one of them is the way that your state does it, which is through appointment. And so some states are looking at the potential for using something sort of like a judicial nominating committee structure to develop criteria that ensures that the people who are administering our elections, secretaries of state or county clerks is what we call them here. They're called county auditors in some places. Different states give them a different name, but there are some structures that say, let's ensure that those people are qualified, and do that through an independent commission that vets them before appointments happen. That's one potential reform arena. And then there's another that says, well, at minimum, let's try to pull the partisanship out of the way that we administer our elections. And this would be a little bit more like the way it's handled in Canada, where election officials don't run with a party affiliation. And as a matter of fact, they don't even vote. They are so committed to their position of impartiality as the election administrator that they don't cast a vote in their own elections. The nonpartisan model of handling it, the way we do in so many parts of the country with our school board races or some of our local mayor races, where you at least pull the DR or I off the ballot, so that when people are voting, they're voting for their election officials based upon what they've researched in terms of their credentials, as opposed to what's the party affiliation that they put behind their name, is potentially another way that we can reduce the perception of partisanship in election administration.
So, Heather, how does one learn more about Election Reformers Network?
Electionreformers.org is our website. And from that jump off point, you can find additional reports on almost every topic that I've described today. We don't have a link to the Jimmy Cliffs video, which I'm going to think that we should probably do. But just about everything else we've talked about, you can get to from electionreformers.org.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Heather. I think most of our viewers support your cause. We're all for fair and honest and trusted elections. We'll see if we can get there, I guess, right?
Sounds great.
And thank you for your time. This has been David Nevins for Citybiz List, also for the Bridge Alliance, and another of our conversations with regard to helping to repair America's broken democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.